Good afternoon, morning, and evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the fifth webinar in the Resilience Matter webinar series. My name is Mayeda Rashid, and I'm the Manager for Capability Development and Engagement at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. And I'm delighted to be host for this session. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Kulin Nations. I also acknowledge the traditional custodian of the various lands of which all of you have joined us today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respect to the elders past and present and acknowledge them the thousands of years that Indigenous people have been caring for this land. I will introduce our speaker shortly, but before I do, I'd like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. This event will be recorded and it will be available along with the presentation slides after the event. So make sure you subscribe to updates to AIDR to receive the link for the recording. Today, during the webinar, we will be using the Q&A features in the Zoom to take your questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat window. You will be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button. And Katelyn Samson, Deputy Director, Resilience and Risk Reduction at AIDR, she will take over from after the presentation and do her best to ask a number of questions to our speaker following the presentation. Please use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentation. And just a reminder that you need to select everyone in the drop-down menu so that everyone can view your messages. I would also like to remind that let's be respectful to each other and our presenter when posting your comments and questions. Just a quick heads up, some of the topics we will cover today, you may find a bit heavy or bring up past experience. If that happens, please take a moment to use any strategies or techniques that work best for you to stay comfortable. The Resilience Matters webinar series is all about how systems, environments, and people interact and how it shapes the risk and challenges we face before, during, and after disasters. Today, we are diving into a really important topic, the ethical premise of disaster management leadership. All right, that's enough from me. Let's jump in. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Mark Crosweller, the Director of Ethical Intelligence. We are thrilled to have Mark here to talk about vulnerability, resilience, and ethics. He will share how, in times of catastrophic disaster, we all experience vulnerability and how we can rethink that vulnerability as something that connects us rather than harm us. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Mayeda. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. A lot of people online, which is really pleasing to see. And it's nice to see AIDR going from strength to strength. I was had the good fortune of being the Director General of EMA when AIDR first emerged from Mount Macedon, and it's just gone from strength to strength. So it's just fantastic. Just before we start, I have this fluency which turns up from time to time, which means I may stutter or struggle with my words. If you can bear with me while I navigate that little complexity, that'd be great. If you're in a room, I call it, it's like buzzword bingo. I get you to guess the word if I couldn't pronounce it, but we'll see how we go. So I want to talk about three things briefly. It'll take about 35 to 40 minutes to tell a story, and then we'll go to questions. I've been in the sector for 40 years now. I'm still a student of all of the things that we experience. I struggle with the concept of being an expert, or I think many of us hold a certain level of expertise because we get that from experience and education and knowledge and skills. And I think that's fair enough, but I don't think any of us are really experts. We're dealing with forces of nature and complexities where we are the student, nature is the teacher. And so what I propose to put forward today are some propositions at the level of philosophy and policy and politics to try and shift the ground, I think, in the way we think about the problem that we're facing, and hopefully be able to contextualize it into your circumstances, particularly through the questions at the end. So we might go to the next slide if we could. And this is just a statement about vulnerability. When we were kids, we thought we didn't think we'd be vulnerable as adults, but it is in fact a human lived experience. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And to be alive is to be vulnerable. I think when we cut off vulnerability, we cut off a part of ourselves, which really is the essence of who we are, particularly our humanity, and particularly our ethos. And ethics is a big part of what we do in disaster management, of course, and we'll give some expression to that today. So if we go to the next slide, I want to look at vulnerability in two ways, societally and institutionally, but then personally, and make the connection between the two, because we can't separate the two. Or if we do separate the two, then what happens is otherwise avoidable suffering will tend to arise inside of our systems. So going to the next slide, excuse me, this is just a picture board of things that I've been in charge of, or had participated in some way, shape or form since about 2003. So there's the Canberra fires, the Victorian fires, the Queensland floods, the Perth Hills fires, the New Zealand earthquake, the Japanese earthquake, and so it goes on. So the reason I show these images is that there's two things that are really striking here. It's the intersection between the forces of nature and people or sentient beings. And that's really the space that we're in. It's the space in which we live. And I make the observation that these things that we can see on the screen are part of natural systems, part of the Earth system. We're aggravating them through climate change impacts and carbonised carbonised economies and so on and so forth, but they are in fact natural phenomena. And somehow we have to learn to live with them better. We have to learn to accept ourselves as being part of nature, not separate, rather than being anthropocentric. That we see ourselves as very much integrated into the systems of nature. And how do we change the relationship? How do we change our perspective and our perceptions about how we're dealing with this problem, or what we perceive as a problem, which may not necessarily have to be a problem in the future? So the forces of nature intersecting with people, earth, wind, fire and water is where the forces come from. Earth, wind, fire and water is what we're constituted by physically in terms of materiality and energy. And I would argue consciousness as well. If we go to the next slide. This is what came out of 2019-2020 narrative and discourse and rhetoric from the politicians and senior leaders, and it continues to concern me, because I asked the question: do we want to be saying these things in 50 years' time? Like, this is what we had to say in 2019, 2020. We've been saying them for a long time, but as policymakers, as advisors, as practitioners, do we really want to be in this space as time goes on? Governments could do no more. Citizen safety could not be guaranteed. Losses would inevitably occur. Communities could prepare for catastrophic impact, inevitability of death, and abandoned localities. I mean, these are very powerful messages, and they were necessary in 2019, 2020. But it's an existential question. Do we still want to be saying them in 50 years? I think we should think a little bit more about that, particularly at the policy and political and philosophical levels. If we go to the next slide, this is the advice we gave the government prior to 2019, 2020 from the National Resilience Task Force. Now, I say unprecedented is not surprising, because we have a rhetoric, it's easing off now in the sector, but we have a rhetoric that says that unprecedented equals surprising. And I really contest that. I think unprecedented is a statistical reality. So the numbers are bigger, the durations are more intense or longer. And so you look at the numbers and they can be unprecedented, but what the numbers are telling us is something we've known for quite some time. I had someone rang me from the RFS in New South Wales about 3 months ago and commented on a report that I wrote way back in 2005 about climate change. And he said, "Do you realise how eerily accurate your report was way back then? That was 20 years ago." And so we've known about climate change and the effects for a long time, but there's a system, a political system particularly, which has been in denial for quite some years, and that has suppressed the policy thinking, suppressed the policy making, and suppressed our ability to prepare adequately for what it is we're now dealing with in real terms. So these things are were unprecedented. They're not unprecedented now, and they're certainly not surprising. And I think the big one to talk about here is the interconnected and interdependent systems. We are so connected and interdependent on technology, for sanitation, water, foods, security, safety, telecommunications, and so it goes on. We derive a real sense of safety from the reliability of those systems. When those systems fail, we feel ontologically insecure. These are, of course, big conversations that we don't have time to unpackage today, but to understand that things are more intense and more complex, and the trajectories are only getting worse. The last point is important. There is momentum to address the financial impacts in a changing climate. That's good, but I think even that has stalled in the last 6 months or so. Going to the next slide. I just want to change some of the ground of the way we think about disasters, and look, much of this is already in the vernacular of the sector, so I don't think you'll find this as particularly anything new, but I think it's important to emphasise this. The catastrophic events are inevitable. That's the event, not the disaster. The disaster is what happens to humans in the intersections with the forces of nature. But the events themselves are inevitable. And I remember having this conversation with Prime Minister Gillard when I first became Director General. And I said, these events catastrophic events are inevitable. And she said, you can't say that. And I said, well, if you stop and think about it, we've had them in our history. So we've witnessed them, we've experienced them. Science says we're going to have them in our future. What part of inevitability doesn't exist between future and past? And she agreed, and she said we should talk more about this. And she was one of the first prime ministers that I knew that was prepared to start to talk about the catastrophe as being highly problematic. Prior to that point, it was generally speaking inside the system, the political system and the bureaucratic system, it was suppressed. Reports were embargoed and we couldn't really talk about it. We talk a lot more about it today, which I think is really important. But unfortunately, we're also normalising it. And it's anything but normal. It's on a trajectory which is intensifying. So we've got to be careful we don't just normalise catastrophic events as being day to day or being no big deal. They're an enormously big deal. Disasters are not natural. Where and how we place ourselves upon the landscape, of course. We've had a lot of conversations about that over the last few years. And really understanding disaster risk is understanding vulnerability. That's where the heart of it sits. So if we go to the next slide, this is a heuristic I've used for quite a number of years now. I published it 10 years ago and updated it about 7 years ago. And I'll just explain the logic. Along the bottom, there's an intensity measure from low to a catastrophic. So that's just how an event unfolds. It could unfold from a low level of intensity to a catastrophic level of intensity. Up the left-hand side of the graph is consequence, and that's shown by orange and red on the bar charts. And that's the level of consequence goes from low to significant as you move up the left. The orange is potential, the red is actual. So the orange would happen along with the red if there was no capacity to treat risk. So if we go to the right-hand side, the risk treatment effectiveness, which is the blue bar, that goes from significant to low. And that's because as things intensify, effectiveness actually drops off. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. So that's the logic of the heuristic. And what it says is this: at the lower end of the scale, we do well. We've got lots of policies and standards and legislation and fire trucks and helicopters and capability and capacity to treat risk. Bad things still happen. They happen for a couple of reasons. There's the unknown unknowns, things we can't foreshadow nor foresee. But there's also where and how we placed ourselves upon the landscape historically, which gets impacted very early on in the intensities. And there was a report produced about 10 years ago that showed that 66% of insurance losses in Australia for flooding occur at that low to moderate level, which is a clear indicator that we put people in the wrong place. When you get to the midpoint, the rules change. And commissioners have said to me, and chief officers and ministers and others have said to me over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, that we dodged a bullet. Things could have been worse, and we'd run out of capability. So we're stretched to our limits. So stretched to our limits and dodged a bullet. That's what happens at the midway point. And that's when capacity to treat risk and impact and consequences are really competing against each other, and the tension starts to unfold. And then you keep going in the intensities to extreme and catastrophic, and the impacts go up exponentially, and the capability or the capacity to treat risk actually drops away. And we know that because we can't launch aircraft in catastrophic fire weather conditions. We can't launch flood boats in extreme flooding conditions, and so it goes on. our policies fail, our legislation is limited, and our capacity as humans becomes limited, and so it goes on. So you see this sort of fading away of capacity. It doesn't lift up with the impacts. Because the trajectories of the impact is going up and the capability is going down, it's like a chasm, and that space is a space of great vulnerability. And I argue it's where everybody and everything becomes vulnerable, where the guarantees that you can have within the limits of risk treatment effectiveness are no longer applicable when they go beyond the limits of risk treatment effectiveness. And so that space for vulnerability looks different for the Prime Minister as it does the Commissioner, as it does the Resident, for example, but it's still a shared space. There is still capacity for harm and suffering with the inability to cope with it. And I think it's important that we understand that context, because it changes the relationship, or could change the relationship, between leaders and followers, between governments and citizens, between citizens and each other, if we had a stronger narrative about what that space actually looks like for all of us. Now, it raises more questions than it answers, of course, but I think it's an honest admission. I think it's true to say the system and all those within it share a vulnerability, and that vulnerability becomes the basis of our relationality if we choose to let it be so. So let's go to the next slide. So what is vulnerability? Well, it's the susceptibility to harm and the inability to cope. It's also the basis of relatedness and relationships. We relate to each other through being vulnerable. We know that through human experience. We know it through education. Brené Brown talks a lot about it. She's probably the most prominent commentator on vulnerability, at least in the popular management literature. There's some really interesting feminist philosophers who talk more profoundly about vulnerability, and it's really worth a read. If we can't see it in ourselves, we won't see it in other people. It is, in fact, that simple. It's the same with suffering. If you can't see suffering in yourself, you won't see it in another person. Other people are like mirrors to our own experiences in the world. It's fundamental and unavoidable to be human, and it requires us to be more responsive to others who are exceptionally vulnerable. So those of us who hold the equities of power, wealth, and resource, hold privilege or status or power, have an obligation, a moral obligation, an ethical obligation to take care of those who are especially vulnerable. It's really important we don't lose sight of that. It's through lived experience that we get to understand vulnerability. You can't think it. I mean, you can think it, but it doesn't help. You have to have the experience. You have to go through the experience as a human being to really understand it. And there are social and cultural influences that either steer us towards or steer us away, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they very much change how we write policy. So that's setting the scene for this institutional setting. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just cause and effect. So on the left is the decisions we make in that space produce effects on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through them all. You can just get a sense of them for yourself. Where and how we place people upon the landscape is critically important in disaster management and resilience, of course, because we know it leads to disproportionate levels of harm and suffering, and so it goes on. So on the left, the extent to which we consider vulnerable communities, citizens, people, systems, governments, leaders, has an effect on the right-hand side. So vulnerability sits in the middle of all of those decisions. And if we take it into account, we get better decisions on the right-hand side. We get less fragile livelihoods. We get more safe locations. We get better protected buildings, and so it goes on. So the balance is pretty clear. If you think of vulnerability as the key aspect of risk and you consider it in your decision-making on the left, you get a better outcome on the right. This perspective comes from Profiling Australia's Vulnerability, which the task force wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, and as I understand it, is still being used, which is good. Full credit to the team who wrote it. If we go to the next slide, there's an example of cause and effect. That was in 2022 on the Gold Coast. Waterfront development site, absolutely. Somebody knew that was water, that was flood prone, yet the system still let it happen. There's a much bigger conversation about this problem, which we don't have time to talk about today, but that's just one example of cause and effect. So if we go to the next slide, there's utopia versus reality. This again is in Profiling Australia's Vulnerability. This is how we want the world to look on the right-hand side, particularly the orange boxes. So we want people to have knowledge of risk and anticipate and reduce consequence and respond and recover and cope. And they're all really powerful words, and they're important. I'm not saying they're not important, but the capacity or the ability for people to achieve that is highly variable. And those who are disproportionately vulnerable have little of any chance of actually meeting this expectation. And one of the difficulties we have with policy writing is it's very utilitarian. So it's the greatest good for the greatest number, based on cost benefit analysis, and the utility being the greatest need for happiness, and so it goes on. I won't labour the point, but it can often miss the vulnerable people, the vulnerable cohorts. And vulnerability can often be categorised in quite limited or narrow ways. And people could be locked into an assumption of vulnerability, which they could be freed from if they were given sufficient agency or opportunity to trade out, for example, which I'll talk about in a second. So yeah, vulnerability sits in the middle of this. If we want all organisations, communities, and individuals to achieve these things, we've got to look at vulnerability systemically and really hit it head on and tackle it as best as we can. Go to the next slide, if we could. So I want to have a look at vulnerability in leadership. So I use this picture advisedly because it's kind of a good metaphor for leadership. It's exhilarating, but it's also lonely. There's many other things as well, of course. But I think leadership requires courage, particularly in the space of vulnerability, and it's rewarding. I think we get a real sense of achievement when we're in the space of our humanity and our relatedness, when we're making a difference as leaders inside systems where it has a real human effect on people, I think, and I want to talk about that now. Next slide, if we could. This is the common perception of vulnerability at the human level. So it's about exposure to harm, pain, stigma, and injustice. It's the ambiguity of not knowing what's going to happen, so harm could manifest and we don't know how it's going to manifest. It may precipitate violence, of course, and there's a lot of defensiveness, avoidance, and a disavowal. And that defensiveness, fear, avoidance, and disavowal is what I want to focus on, because that's where vulnerability often heads towards, this disavowal and denial, because it's so problematic around a negative conception or a negative perception. If we go to the next slide, feminist philosophers have a much broader view, and I think a more refreshing view about vulnerability. And that is that it's not only about harmfulness, it's about relationality, capacity for imagining, feeling, and seeing the suffering of other people. I think that's fundamental in leadership. See it inside of yourself as a way and means of seeing it inside of other people. The basis for learning, empathy, compassion, connection, transformation, and community. An ontological condition that links humans to non-humans. If my door is open, my dogs would be by my feet. We all have a connection with animals. We all have a connection with sentient beings which are not human, and we need to consider that in the context of our policy writing and our decision making and our actions. And it's part of it's definitive of life, and it's not always controllable. You can't always control how you feel or where vulnerability takes you. So it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. If we go to the next slide, this comes out of my PhD research from about 8 years ago. I asked leaders a series of questions, and you can get a sense of the questions by the data. Do they see themselves as vulnerable inside of their systems and organisations? 3/4 said yes. Even more said they're prepared to show it at work, some conditionally, some unconditionally. But is it seen as strength or weakness? Well, it flips over and it's seen predominantly as a weakness. And I asked them, had they seen a denial of vulnerability? So this denial, disavowal, or ignorance of vulnerability, and 90% said yes, definitely. And that led to this really clear expression of arrogance and overconfidence. And unfortunately, I don't like to say it and sound morally judgmental or righteous in any way, shape, or form, but the sector has an aspect to it, not all of it, not all the time, but has a pervasive overconfidence. I saw it on the side of a fire truck the other day. I think it said, "We're prepared for anything." And maybe in a certain context they might be, but is the sector is it really prepared for anything? That's an existential question. I would suggest no, it's not prepared for anything. I think it's an aspiration, and I have no trouble with the line for the fire service and what they're trying to achieve and how they're trying to portray their organisation and the direction in which they're heading. I think those are all commendable. But are we there? Can we get there? I think that's an existential question worth thinking about. So I don't want this to be taken as criticising the fire service, who has the proposition because I think it's a reasonable proposition, but it's existentially, I just wonder, is it in fact true? So if we go to the next slide, when we accept vulnerability, we get these attributes in culture and leadership, and I won't go through them all because time won't permit, but they're pretty impressive, I think. And I put this slide to groups and organisations, and I say, how does it make you feel? And generally speaking, it makes people feel pretty good. It makes them feel more human. It makes them they're on a pathway towards feeling happier or more satisfied or more whatever in a positive sense, because I think that's what vulnerability does. It opens up our humanity. If we go to the next slide, when we deny it, disavow it or ignore it, it kind of does the opposite. So it closes down, shuts off, and denies our humanity, denies our ability to connect. So it goes on, it increases bullying and harassment, and you can see it all there for yourself. So there's a direct correlation, and it's really strong in the literature. It's not just my research. There's much literature and statistics and numbers which put forward this proposition about denial, ignorance, and disavowal as opposed to acceptance. And I think it's good to reflect upon it. If we go to the next slide, we need wisdom about vulnerability in our leadership and in our systems. So there's a couple of things I want to point out here. I want to go to the bottom right-hand side, and I want to ask the existential question: who are you being and who are you becoming? Because vulnerability moves us on a continuum. So we are not fixed entities. I'll be very Buddhist when I say this as a Buddhist philosopher, but we are streams of consciousness. We're rivers, not rocks. We're always moving from being to becoming. The body you were born with is not the body you have now. It's not the body you'll die with if you live a full life. The same is true of your mind. The mind you were born with is not the mind you have now. If you live a full life, we're having the mind you die with. We're in a process of flux and change, in a process of unfolding in a continual way. We're rivers, not rocks. It's important to ask in leadership, again, it's an existential question. Who am I being in this moment in time? So how am I presenting to the world? And in which direction am I heading? Am I heading in a negative way? Am I heading in a positive way? Am I moving towards being beneficial and compassionate and kind and trustworthy towards others and myself? Or am I moving in another direction? And again, existential question. We move all over the place, of course. We can't be consistent in our direction, but it's a good question to ask. The top left-hand one's also important. We need to be clear about boundaries. So we don't want to be foolish with vulnerability. We don't want to expose ourselves to harm and suffering and be unable to cope with it unnecessarily. So trust is an important part. The ethic of trust is a very important part here, as is the ethic of wisdom, the practical wisdom of our lived experience and the wisdom of the sages. What does wisdom have to say about being vulnerable at this moment in time in this circumstance for which I find myself? The point I want to make here is that think about that boundary and that limitation, but move in the direction of relatedness. Don't move away from it. So you might be limited in your ability to move because of the harmfulness and the circumstances for which you find yourself. And wisdom might say now is not the time to be vulnerable, but in five minutes time or 5 days time, maybe it is time to be vulnerable. So that conscious or mindful reflection about relatedness and vulnerability is important. And of course, you can see the other statements of wisdom there for yourself. And these slides come from my book, Compassion in Disaster Management, and I think we can make the slides available if you'd like them at the end of this webinar. If we go to the next slide, this comes out of my PhD as well. We find ourselves fundamentally on a continuum in disaster management and resilience. This notion of being invulnerable, so this denial, ignorance, and disavowal of vulnerability, it's pervasive in society. It's not just in the sector, it's in society. When we deny, disavow, or ignore our vulnerability and that of others, it leads to an insensitivity. We fail to see the potential for suffering of ourselves and other people and their inability or our inability to cope. We become insensitive to that. That insensitivity leads to an insufficiency of response. So we're insufficient in our capacity to deal with it or to limit it, or so it goes on. The sector more broadly has this habit of being compliant. So it hides behind compliance, rules, laws, legislation, policy, standards, processes. They're there for a very good reason. They're there to protect, and I'm not dismissing them, saying that they're wrong, but they can be a limiting factor. And of course, we get defensive when criticised. And because we're trading in a world of fear and outrage, and that's the global politics at the moment, is fear and outrage. this insensitivity, insufficiency, compliance, and defensiveness is quite rampant. It's quite pervasive. But we have an alternative along this continuum, and that is to be relatable. When we give ourselves permission to see our own suffering and the suffering of others, or the vulnerability of ourselves and others, we establish this relatability. It tends to generate a commitment to doing something about it. So that's a natural human disposition to move in the direction of actually doing something about that harmfulness that we share as humans and non-humans. We often have to be venturous about how we do that. So we have to take great risks, personal, moral, and otherwise, physical. So it's not necessarily easy. And we're still held to account for results. So we can't walk away from accountability. Now, when I put this slide up in lectures, I say to people, which one is easier? And it's interesting to watch the look on people's faces, because the truth is the easier part of this continuum is to be invulnerable. It's just easy. You don't have to think so much. You don't have to feel so much. You don't have to care so much. But what's more rewarding is the right-hand side of the continuum. It's much more rewarding to be relatable and committed, venturous and accountable. But it's harder. It's more difficult. We've got to put ourselves in the shoes of another. We have to stretch ourselves morally and ethically, relationally. We have to stretch our boundaries. We have to develop more empathy. We have to take more emotional risk. And we're taught not to do that, particularly frontline workers who have to be very clinical and objective in their execution of their duties, and rightfully so. But we don't want to carry that into management and leadership for the rest of our careers. So the protective factors are important. I'm not saying we drop them, but I'm saying we need to consider their limitations in other circumstances. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you the data just really quickly. There's the insensitive pulse. It's about twice 1.5 times what the relatable pulse is. So I would prefer to see much more blue than orange, but a little bit of orange is fine, because that's where we land as humans, and that's okay. There's no morality to that. That's just what we do. But if you look at the insensitivity, it's quite striking, and that's pervasive in our culture at the moment. If I go to the next slide, you'll see what that insensitivity looks like. So it's really ID 1, 3 through to 6, and then 9. So others are vulnerable and need a paternalistic intervention, choosing not to know, privileged positioning, overconfidence, devaluation, and fear of being vulnerable. They're really prominent attributes of culture and leadership and insight around this notion of insensitivity. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's this relatability. So the open to affectivity and emotional engagement, so open to being affected emotionally, is really important, and having empathy, RD8. So walking in the shoes of another, showing emotional resonance. So we can do it, and we do it. I'm advocating we need to do more of it, and we need the courage to do more of it, and the advocacy to do more of it. So if we go to the next slide, I'm really racing through this because we've got lots to talk about, and you can take this away with you. But what I want to say here is just 2 points out of the 6. When we deny, disavow, or ignore vulnerability, it leads to unnecessary increases in harm and suffering, what I call otherwise avoidable suffering. So suffering that could be avoided, or harm that could be avoided, is allowed to flourish. When we embrace vulnerability, so we don't deny it, but we embrace it and we manage it and we accept it as part of the relationality, that same otherwise avoidable suffering reduces, because our actions move towards doing something about it, and the correlation is direct. So depending on how we look at this thing called vulnerability, has a big effect on the outcome, without a doubt. If we go to the next slide, I want to quickly touch on resilience, and then we'll finish on the ethical conversation. Moving to the next slide, if we could. The Royal Commission had a lot to say about this 4 or 5 years ago. It was comprehensive, what Mark Binskin and his commissioners discovered, and the extent to which the sector participated, which was significant. Discovered a lot of good things, and most people said we already know the problems. The big challenge is how do you move to solutions. And I think Commissioner Binskin said that governments fail to act on the recommendations will shift the risk to others. We really need to think about that, because the citizen is very heavily loaded up with obligations and responsibilities, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. Now, I'm not advocating for a welfare state. I'm not saying citizens don't have a role. They do. Personal responsibility, social contract of shared responsibility is really important. The question is one of balance. The question is one of the apportion of responsibilities between governments and the citizens in a systemic sense. Where does that balance lie? And our narratives have a lot to shift that balance one way or another. So if we go to the next slide, here's a definition of resilience, which comes from the IPCC. I won't read it all because you can read it for yourselves, but the essential function, identity and structure while maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning and transformation. So the ability to cope with a hazardous event with those attributes is how the IPCC describes resilience. Now, there's about 90 definitions of resilience in the academic literature. This is just one of them, but it's a pretty good one. The intention is adaptability, anticipatory learning and innovation for reducing vulnerability and increasing adaptive capacity. It's really important. The anticipatory learning, innovation, adaptability to reduce vulnerability and increase adaptive capacity. That's the intent. What happens in reality in our narratives and much of our policy thinking and writing is that we decouple reduction in vulnerability and increases in adaptive capacity, and instead we foreground self-managed individual resilience as a means to address risk. And you may or may not agree with that, and I appreciate some discussion on this at the end of it. But I had a look at the resilience policies going back to 2009, 2011, 2014, and it's a very strong emphasis on this individualism, which comes from a political discourse, which I'll talk about in a minute. So again, I'm not saying it's not appropriate to talk about individuals, but the extent to which we put pressure on them is what I question. So if we go to the next slide, this will take about 3 or 4 minutes to wrap up, and then we can have a chat. The attributes in the blue are what's called communitarian. So they're more balanced. The pendulum of responsibility, shared responsibility, sits more in the middle between the governments and the citizens when the blue turns up. So an opportunity to exercise agency would, for example, mean that structural, economic, social and environmental systems are balanced and give people an opportunity to actually exercise agency to the extent of which they are able. What tends to happen in our policy writing is we expect them to exercise agency, but we don't necessarily take into account their social, economic, environmental or structural circumstances, largely because we take utilitarian approaches and we can't contextualize or contextualize into the circumstances of small communities or individuals. And you can understand the challenges of trying to do that, of course. But you have a look at all the orange, and it's pretty harsh language. Take the pressure off response and recovery. I've heard that for a long time in my career, as opposed to having access to community resource. Responsible for their own misfortunes, as opposed to being able to shape public policy. Access to free and full information or possess situational awareness. I can promise you the governments don't have full situational awareness, particularly in times of catastrophe. They don't have it. They need to, they don't have it. So if the government doesn't have it, how can the citizen possibly have it? It's another existential question. So you'll just get a sense here that there's a pretty tough narrative in our policy writing, which is represented by the orange. And there's also part of the blue in our policy writing as well, but our narrative is unbalanced. And I'll show you that in the next slide. So we go to the next slide. So those attributes are now represented in statistics. And you can see the orange is what I call the neoliberal or individualistic approaches, and then the blue is the communitarian approaches. So I would prefer to see more blue than orange, or at least a greater balance. What neoliberalism does, it's a political philosophy which has been around since the late 70s, early 80s, introduced by Thatcher and Reagan, history of which I don't have time to talk about today. But it talks about this: smaller government, contestability, outsourcing, deregulation, personal responsibility, entrepreneurship, productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness. All of those words, if you're in a bureaucratic system, you're trading on every day. And we don't ever realise we're doing it. And we will defend those attributes in our policy writing. We'll actually defend them. I'll show you what that means in the next slide. So go to the next slide. Here are 3 questions I asked 90 leaders across 3 countries in the world at very high levels, from US governors and commissioners and ministers and all sorts of people. Is it reasonable to expect people to be resilient in all circumstances to natural hazards influenced by climate change? 60% said it wasn't reasonable. It's actually not reasonable to ask people to be resilient in all circumstances. I said, what about unknown hazards? It flips over. 60% say, yes, it is reasonable to be resilient in all circumstances. I said, what about climate change? It goes up to 73%. It's reasonable in all circumstances to expect citizens to be resilient. And what was happening in the narrative was that when the leader was pushed on the systemic limitations, instead of advocating for more system change and a change in policy, the general attitude is to push it to the citizen, to say the citizen should do more. Very few leaders talked about the system needing to do more, or the governments needing to do more, or to change or to rebalance things. And that's picked up in the discourse. So people don't intend it to be that way, but that's what's happening in the narrative. That's what's happening in our voice, because we're so influenced by this political ideology, which has been around for 40 years. And if you're as old as me, you probably vaguely remember a different ideology. It was Keynesian economics, which is more around welfare economics. And then there was a big shift in the late 70s, early 80s, which I didn't notice, but I did notice in the early 90s when I became a superintendent in the fire service about this need for productivity and efficiency and effectiveness. And it never went away. Every year we have to find an efficiency dividend. Every year for 30 years. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. We're getting a little bit pushed for time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this last couple of slides. But the thing I want to say here is that expert systems and professional expertise is the basis of trust. And we've really got to think about our expert systems and professional expertise as a way of securing trust of community, because they're going elsewhere for that. Disinformation and misinformation is a big part of that. So the grey zone, the battlefield of the grey zone of disinformation is having a big effect on the trust of organisations. So we've got to think a lot about our expert systems and professional expertise. Free and full information is fundamental. I worked for a time in national security where it was a need to know environment. Emergency management, disaster management in the natural hazards world is a need to share environment. There's very little, if any, information we should be holding back. It should be free and full and accessible as a way of government's contribution or institutional contributions to decision making. And we need to see risk as value or valuable, not just about likelihood and consequence. And again, these are big conversations which, again, we don't have much time for today, but some things to think about. If we go to the next slide. The one I want to talk about here is recovery. So I think it's about renewal, regeneration, and reorganisation. It's not about just recovering. And there's a lot of conversations happening in the recovery world about this approach, which I applaud, and probably have more comprehensive conversations than I'm having now. And this notion of anticipating or anticipated histories, it's really getting ahead of loss and saying what's under threat. From what's under threat, what's valuable. From what's valuable, what's tradable, and what's not tradable. And that's commensurate and non-commensurate value. So that's things you can put a dollar value on, and things you cannot possibly put a dollar value on. Things like relic, ritual, memory, hopeful future. Things that make a space a place. Things that make a space a place can often be measured in non-commensurate terms. And we need to think about that anticipated history. What are we prepared to lose? Because we're going to lose things unless we get really, really good at policy writing and policy enacting. And we've got to somehow stratify that in the context of a broader set of values than just economic. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk in the last 2 minutes about ethics and pose a series of questions to generate some discussion. So if we go to the next slide. I've said this for many years, and anything I say is contestable. I'm not saying I know it all, far from it, quite the opposite actually, but anyway. But what my career taught me over 40 years was that the greatest measure of success was in fact the upholding of public trust and confidence. We can't control the death rates, we can't control the losses. There's so many things we cannot control in a space of catastrophic disaster, before, during, or after. But there's something we can have a large amount of control over, and that is the way we secure trust. And there's a very rich and deep conversation about how we do that. But I think the measure of success is true, that if you uphold public trust and confidence throughout crisis, prior, during, and after, you'll get a better result. People will feel better. They'll have a better experience than otherwise if trust wasn't there. So part of our role in emergency management or disaster management and resilience, and people don't even realise they're doing this because it's still a difficult experience, is to actually make the experience less difficult. It could be worse than it was, and it could be worse than it was physically, but also emotionally as well. And the greatest mission is reduction of suffering, human and non-human. In other words, how do we visage and how do we promote compassionate institutions, organisations, and leaders? Institutions in their broadest sense cannot be compassionate because they're kind of juggernauts, their systems, their policies, their procedures, their things. It's hard to make things compassionate, but the people inside of them, the people using those things and writing those things and executing them can be compassionate. And I think that's a conversation absolutely worth having for a number of years to come about how do we shift the dial on being, we're already compassionate, I'm not saying we're not, but how do we become more compassionate? How do we actually expand the possibility or the probability or the likelihood of being more compassionate than we are now? So I'll go to the next slide, I think the last couple of slides. My research said these are the most important ethics to disaster management leaders in every part of the system. I think that's probably true. You may contest some of that, but I think it's good to know. We all sit in this space. We all do this stuff. We all like to be defined this way from a character perspective. We like to be relied upon for these things, and we are relied upon for these things, and we should invest in them. And I just want to finish on the last slide, which is the key ethical questions, which will either generate some discussion or you might have some questions of your own. But how do we recognise suffering as a universal experience? How do you have compassion for many people? How do you avoid exploitation? How do you trust moral intuition? How do we remain grounded so we don't become egotistical? How do we show self-compassion? How do you how do you influence a system if you're in the middle of it? These are big ethical questions, which I'd be really happy to talk about, or any other questions you might have. But my proposition is, colleagues, and thank you for joining today, is that we do a fine job. I really want to make that point. We do a great job, but we've got existential challenges coming up, which are going to have to make us think very deeply and broadly about how we change philosophically the way we see the world and we manage into the future. Because what's happening at the moment, because of our politics of fear and outrage and many other factors, we're caught in what I call a rampant incrementalism. So our capability uplifts are rampantly incremental against exponential increases in harm and suffering. We have to make bigger decisions. We've got to take greater leaps of faith. And most importantly, I think our relationships institutionally and between governments and citizens and with inside governments and private and public sector needs to be more harmonious than it's ever been before. And there's a lot of contestation of ideas, which is great, but how we treat each other in the contestation of those ideas and what goes on in the darkness of the culture is not helpful. And somehow we have to liberate back into the light a sense of unity and sense of purpose, because nature is very kind. She'll tell us what she's about to do, but she won't ask and she won't wait. And unfortunately, we're bogged down in some pretty silly debates at the moment in the system, implying that we've got time to have those debates or those arguments. Nature is saying, no, that's actually not true. So, Kayla, that's me. I'll stop talking and start listening again.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. I could listen to you all day. You have so much wisdom and experience to share, and we're certainly students here along with you along the journey. For those who don't know me, I'm Katelyn Samson. I'm Deputy Director of Resilience and Risk Reduction across the partnership of AIDR and AFAC. And I have the privilege of asking Mark a few questions. And there's some really great questions coming through the Q&A. So thanks so much to Margaret, Simon, Rowena, Mark, and a couple of others. And I think they're really getting to the heart of some of those practicalities. So I think if I frame up their questions, they'd really like to know, what are some of those practical steps that leaders in our sector can really take to embody the sort of leadership that you're talking about here? So, to embrace that vulnerability, the relationality that you speak about, to be compassionate, empathetic, trustworthy, self-aware, humble leaders. We can keep listing off those qualities. What are some of those practical things in terms of training, education? Like, how can we kind of move towards this kind of leadership in our sector?
It's a really good question, and I'll put a lot on the table, so I think the question's great. I think it goes back to the slide on vulnerability about who are you being, who are you becoming, and I think there's a whole other conversation in ethics about character, about virtue, and we like to be identified as being trustworthy, compassionate, kind, considerate, truthful, and so it goes on. That's a big part of our identity. I don't think we should walk away from that. I think we should have a great sense of humility about those attributes of character, because we've got things that aren't helpful as well. You know, we don't always tell the truth. Let's be real about it. We can't perfect our virtue, but we can move along a pathway where we get better over time and learn from experience about how to be that way more. I'd like to see the sector be more confident in its ethical proposition, more liberated in its conversations about how to improve in that space without judgment, without harsh judgment and criticism and moral righteousness, because I think it's the essence to good leadership. The thing I found in my career, I remember one meeting, hopefully people online won't have the meeting because they might have a different view, but anyway, it was in Commonwealth State Relations, and it was over money, and it was a really tough meeting, and the discourse it just fell apart. I'll never forget it. It just went into a world that it didn't need to go to. I remember thinking to myself at the time, compassion's going to have to sit in the corner here, because this conversation is too brutal. And so in my mind, I put compassion in the corner, because compassion is an important part of my leadership. I'm not perfect at it, but it's an important part of my leadership. We had the big battle, and then things did settle, and compassion got put back on the table. I could bring it back in again. I think the art of good leadership is being mindful of where you're at, being mindful of your ethical disposition, and where and when can you use it, and where and when can you not use it. Because we live in a continuum. You know, there's always opportunity to be the way we want to be if we're more mindful about how we wish to be to start with. And the thing also is, if you're in an institutional framing, you've got access to greater or lesser degrees to the equities of power, wealth, and resource. That's what drives economies, is what drives institutions, is the redistribution of the equities of power, wealth, and resource. Now, if you're a minister, you've got control of them. If you're a commissioner, you've got control of the advice. If you're halfway down the system, you've probably got responsibility for the execution of them. But even with responsibility for the execution, there'll be room for discretion. There'll be room for consideration of context in the circumstances for which you find yourself. And so we can often get caught up in utilitarian approaches where we think we have to do things the same way all the time, or the same for everybody. I would like to see a culture which allows for discretion within limits, with understanding the possibility of exploitation and all those things that happen when you introduce discretion, but giving people license and liberty to be more vulnerable, to be more relational, and maybe make a couple of mistakes along the way, but maybe that's all right as well, because the system's making big mistakes at the moment, I can promise you. If the system thinks it's not making mistakes, then let's disavow that straight away. So I think having a culture of openness and flexibility and relatedness, relationality, and seeing that grow over time, and leaders prepared to advocate for it. I can tell you, Katelyn, that the higher you go in a system, the harder it gets to be this way, because it's about power and it's about survival. And so when you become a commissioner or a director general or a minister, you're trying to survive a system. You're training on power first and foremost, and then those other things tend to fall away. So inside the system, we can lift these leaders up. I think leaders 2, 3, 4, 5 tiers down probably have greater opportunity to be this way than the leaders at the top at the moment. That's certainly what I've discovered interviewing those leaders. But look, there were ministers and governors that took great risks in their portfolios and their careers, and some paid a big price, but the price was worth paying. You know, I think there's a question of moral conscience over time, and legacy, and doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And the price can be enormous. There's no doubt about that. But you've got to live with your moral conscience as well.
So you're providing us with a really incredible critique of power, of leadership, and responsibility. Are there any examples of leaders that really come to mind that really embody this kind of ethical approach to leadership? You've name dropped some pretty impressive people so far, but who really comes to mind when you think about this style of leadership that you're looking to?
So one of them is Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and look, there's I've experienced both sides of the debate about Ms. Ardern's leadership from a policy perspective, and I think that's a complex conversation. But let's go to the crisis management aspect of her leadership. Impressive. Christchurch massacre, the earthquake in the North Island, the White Island volcanic eruption, COVID-19. Empathy, kindness, and well-being were the attributes of her leadership, which she continued to display and use effectively in the context of those crises, and it yielded significant results. I think, unfortunately, as humans, we sanctified her. So we kind of made her holy. This is very spiritual language, but I'm using it advisedly. But we then demonized her as well. And the problem is those we sanctify, we demonize. I think what she was effectively doing was exemplifying kindness, empathy, and well-being as exemplification. And as a Buddhist, I'd say the reason we could see kindness, empathy, and well-being is because we can recognize it in ourselves. So if you can see it in someone else, you'll see it in yourself. The context may be different, but the experience is universal. The other one was a US governor. I'm reluctant to say who it was because of the confidentiality of research, but in a state of 24 million people, and he engaged a local community of parents with kids with disability who weren't happy with the policy settings of the state, and they asked the governor to attend. And about 400 parents, and this is in my book as well, and they got into him, like kind of you got stuck into the government about the policy settings because the kids had become wards of the state when the parents died. They weren't happy about the settings, and he listened and he said, "Look, I don't have a child with disability. I don't have that circumstance, but I want to learn." So he said to one of the parents, "How about I come and live with you for 5 days, and you can show me what it's like to raise a child with disability?" And she said yes, and he did. He went and lived with her for 5 days, and he's so profoundly moved by the experience, he came back and changed the policy settings. And a number of ministers told me similar stories where they said, sometimes you've got to give up the policies and sit down and talk to people and listen. And what they're all referring to was two things I wrote about in my book, was the symbolism of the story of one representing the story of many and the sentiment of that story. And it's one of the ways of having compassion for many people is that listen for the stories, listen for the sentiment in that story, and understand the symbolism that story of one is representing in broad terms the story of many. And I think the other thing is context and circumstance could be wildly different. And so if we try and relate to context or circumstance, we can say, I can't relate. We can relate to human experience. And this is a very personal thing. I said this in my TED talk. When Carolyn passed away, my wife, 2.5 years ago, people would say, I can't possibly understand how you must be feeling. And I let them talk, and I realized they could because they hadn't lost a husband, a wife, or a spouse, or a child even, but they lost someone they loved. And that was enough to be relatable. That experience of loss of another human being was enough to establish a relationship which eased the trauma of my grief. And I talk a lot about that in my book, and I continue to teach this stuff and talk about it. Listen for the experience. As a leader, listen for the experience, and then understand the equities of power, wealth, and resource you have available to yourself that you might be able to execute in the context of that direction. And I think it leads to a very powerful recipe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. You have so much to offer, and we're so very grateful for your time. Unfortunately, we can only package up your offerings today in a 1-hour webinar, but we could certainly keep listening to you all day. So we're very grateful for your time today, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. So we'll wrap up the webinar today. I'd also like to thank my AIDR colleagues, Angela Draper and Charlotte Fell, for their work in the background to bring this to you all. We'd like to acknowledge the support of NEMA for bringing this important resource to us all. And just a note as well that our final event for the year is fast approaching. That's our Resilient Australia Awards, and you can register to attend online for those awards. And when you leave the call today, you'll have a short survey, so and provide us with some information about what you'd like to hear about and some more of our professional development events coming up. So it's been my absolute pleasure to finish off this webinar today. And until next time, I hope you all stay well and safe. And thanks very much for joining us. Goodbye.